Hello! In this video, I'll just tell you a few words about the main highlights of these two articles. The links will be also found in the description. Would you wish to use an online translator and get references to all the sources used, because this video is based on mainstream sources exclusively, and it shows how difficult was it for them indeed to squeeze the actual historic findings in terms of sites and literature into the popular mainstream timeline of history, which again and again I have shown is not based on the historic findings and old books. Instead of that, it was ready-made, and then it was forced onto the scientific community. Those who wished to remain with the status of scientists, they had to somehow, whatever they find or discover, they had to squeeze it into this timeline or lose their jobs. And although these two articles deal with the pre-Christianity times in the history of the Slavic people, as they call them, in reality, as I have shown in a couple of the previous videos, in older times, the term Slavic people included most of the European nations, and only in recent modern times, the term has been made to have a narrow meaning as a part of the implementation of the overall plan of divide and conquer. The most impressive part for me from the full material was a contemporary description of a Byzantine emperor who undertook a travel himself to meet the ruler Knyaz Svetoslav of the Slavic people, and the actual meeting took place at a river bank. So, needless to say, the Byzantine emperor was dressed with gold fabrics, top to bottom, precious gemstones, and everything else, of course, accompanied by numerous guards and servants. And he was waiting for the king of the Slavic people, who, by the way, have defeated the Byzantine Empire couple of times. And for that reason, the Byzantine emperor had to undertake the journey himself. But to his utter dismay, when the time of the meeting arrived, he saw a simple boat crossing the river. Few simple-looking men were paddling the boat. And to the absolute surprise of the Byzantine emperor, one of these simple men, who was also paddling along with the others, turned out to be the king. Not only the king participated in the manual work required by the situation at hand, namely paddling the boat, but also his outfit was in no way superior to that of the men who were accompanying him. So this happened at the times when the Slavic people lived freely, before Christianity was forced upon them. In certain regions, in order to force people to become Christians, they had to behead 3/4 of the population just to get 1/4 of the remaining people to somehow or other accept it, swallow it up. I think this by itself shows very well that Christianity was corrupted by the evil very soon after it came to existence. Even in its early stages, so much murder in the name of Christianity. I really doubt this has anything to do with the intention of Jesus Christ. So this scene, this episode with the modestly dressed king wasn't some exception, maybe some arrangement for the trouble or anything like that. No, not all. That was the rule. And it is confirmed by really mainstream excavations. Yeah, not all mainstream scientists are penguin. Some of them frankly wrote. When we excavate the settlements of the pre-Christian Slavic people, they write, we find no gap whatsoever between rich and poor. Even people whose social position or occupation would have made it very easy for them to hoard money, they apparently were not interested in hoarding, and they had a living standard like everybody else. For example, this is a quote from a foreign traveler who visited such settlements, Otton Bamberg. Not only he described the Slavic people as really nature people, but also he shared that they were surprised when they noticed that the foreigners lock their traveling boxes, the alternatives of the modern suitcases, where the travelers would have kept their precious belongings. The very concept of locking something as a way of protecting it from thieves, that was like an amusing idea for the Slavic people because they didn't have really experience with local theft, and the full idea of the theft as a phenomena sounded very weird for them. So the way the paid historians dealt with the problem of explaining this full situation is like this. Well, people at that time in those regions, they were like semi people. So basically, they were so dumb that they could not have yet discovered even the theft. Yeah, still hanging on their tails from the trees, which is of course absolutely not true. They had, for example, fine clothing. Hundreds of fine garments made of silk, pure silk, were discovered in this type of settlements. Also, they had social structure, advanced social structure, which allowed them to even conquer a couple of times, defeat Istanbul. So this reveals very well that it is an absolute nonsense what they are telling us that this gap between rich and poor arose as a natural byproduct of the emancipation of the human society. This is just a lie which we are fed so that we can swallow it nowadays and believe that there is no option but to live with this gap. And so we continue voting for criminal politicians who pretend not to notice this major problem of the money hoarding. The evil of hoarding money is not about being rich. Actually, when we end up this criminal money hoarding, then all of us will be rich. Money hoarding is about possessing really unreasonable amount of riches, like many billions, and then this is being used to buy immunity against law, immunity against the law for common people, and with this type of money they even managed to buy the position of lawmakers. And then we, the stupid sheep, we think that we live in democracy just because we are completely free to go to the store for toys and select the craziest or the sweetest looking puppet. We can choose whichever puppet we like, and that's why we think that we live in democracy and that we're free people because we have a free pass to the store for children's toys. And although most of the written records from that time, the pre-Christian, are of course nowhere to be seen, even from whatever the Christian occupators wrote down as memories of whom were they exterminating. Even from that, even there we can find some pretty interesting stuff about the social structure, which should have been a monarchy at that time, if the mainstream history, or at least its conclusions, are correct. But no, what the Christian chronicles describe is something completely different. Although the king had some ruling authority, it was not absolute. He was subservient to the council of elders, and in case he was not actually implementing the policies which these elders, which were in reality representatives of the clans, representatives of the real people, if he was not ruling according to the way people wanted, he was replaced by the council of the elders. So there was much more democracy actually back then, because now it has become a common practice for many presidents to take decisions which are against the will of the majority of the people of the country. So the penguins always assure us that it was the church, the clergy, which was the center of education and, of course, of all writing and alphabets. And if it wasn't this super booper church, our monkey fur would never fall off. Let's see what kind of written records we have from pre-church time. And in the recent decades, thousands of such records have been excavated, and these are birch bark manuscripts. Interestingly enough, they were common both for the Slavic people and also for the Vedic societies, the Vedic cultures of nowadays India. Yet another aspect which shows the connection between them. In previous videos there were many other connections made. So from the dates written on these documents and the clearly pagan names and titles of the people who wrote them, there is no doubt these were pre-Christian written documents. Mostly these were simply letters which people from faraway places exchanged. One of them was even written by a 6-year-old. Many of them were written by women, which showed a very high rate of literacy amongst women in those times. Which of course the penguins again forgot to include in history, because that's, that period is for monkeys, so where do you get literate women in those times? That doesn't match, so out of the history. But fortunately, some of the records of the actual excavations were published, so we know what they found at least. And by the way, the sheer volumes of such letters found is quite astonishing. Yep, most probably we haven't even found all of them naturally. So people were writing quite actively, and on the top they had a very well organized postal system over vast areas. And all that is in times when officially they were so dumb that they couldn't even get themselves together to stitch proper clothes, so they were wrapped in rugs. And as for literacy, they've never heard officially the word alphabet even. And what is the official explanation of all this postal system? Well, they have the story like this. Yes, the people who were corresponding, maybe they were not really like Christian, but you see, the postal service itself must have been run by Christians because the rest is monkeys, you know? How can they deliver to an address? But when they tell such stories to the history students, they again miss some details, like, for example, how could have a couple of monks, a dozen or so of them, organize the full postal service and writing the mail for quite few millions of people. And this organization would also include delivery to tens of thousands of remote villages. So this handful of monks, my God, what kind of mystic powers did they have? Because in modern times, thousands of postmen and postwomen are needed to do the same job, along with vehicles and even airplanes to carry the mail. So, in other words, this full story of the church bringing education and writing to the stupid pagans, that is just yet another lie to artificially endorse, inflate with helium the authority of the church, so that people will listen to the church. Yes, in modern times, wars are endorsed by the church. Ugly sexual perversions are also endorsed by some churches. And in general, the church serves very well to ensure the people just continue to be a good sheep and don't you worry about your soul. We will take complete care and control of your soul. Yeah? Now, let's see what was the situation with slavery. Again, a phenomena which, according to penguins, was again a product of the evolution of the human society and appeared on the historic scene when people were barbaric, the cruel pagan barbarian monkeys, of course, being the best candidates. So, how did Slavic people keep slaves? Descriptions were found in the old chronicles, and they were allowed to keep people that they called slaves only in case they were captured during battle from the enemies. They were not allowed to keep their own countrymen as slaves. But when it comes to the actual description of how were they treating these alleged slaves, it turns out that these were simply servants. And they had equal rights with the members of the Slavic society, which had the lowest rank. And during the time for which they were forced to remain as servants with a given family, they were treated as family members and not as cattle. So, although they say slaves, they actually had servants, and if somebody ended up in such position, it was for a given number of years, after which the war captive could choose whether he would want to remain or he also could go back to his home country or settle elsewhere. He was a free person after this given number of years were over. And as far as real slavery in these lands, there was a lot of it, but we are not told, we are being confused with play of words, skillful renaming of things to obscure their essence. And whatever is now known as крепостное право in Russian or serfdom in English was in some cases nothing else but a full-fledged slavery. Now, everything I said earlier in this video probably refers to most of Europe, But this about the serfdom being, for all practical purposes, most cruel slavery keeping is definitely true for Siberia and Russia, where they had to apply extreme measures because entire regions over there were populated with people of a very high consciousness, and they had to lower it. Exactly as cruelly treated, beaten, abused animals bear the scars of such traumas, and gradually their mentality becomes crooked and twisted. In the same way, they lowered the level of the human consciousness in those regions using exactly this cruelty. People were sold, raped, treated much worse than cattle. And this was in no way a product of the gradual evolution of the human society, as they're telling us in those thick books in the libraries. This was something centrally organized and centrally carried out for a short period. In other lands, the forms of serfdom were much milder, and it would mostly express itself by the inability to relocate without the permission of the local duke or something like that. And the mildest forms of serfdom survived even modern times in the forms of all kinds of residence permits, even within given countries. But of course, that is being gradually abolished because it is simply an old-fashioned tactic of slave keeping. Now they focus on modern methods, which involve the slaves happily and absolutely voluntarily complying to stupid rules, which they consider democratic, or also carrying around devices which distribute the orders of the slave masters. Also, they report full details about us to the slave masters, and in addition, their working frequencies damage our nervous systems, which, along with the constantly broadcasted by these devices scenes of violence which traumatize us, these both factors are sufficient to constantly lower our consciousness even more. And all this is done in a seamless manner. When the next model of the slave device appears, people voluntarily wait for it days in a row. They sleep on the sidewalks to get hold of the next model the first day it appears on the market. True knowledge and freedom are qualities of goodness. They walk hand in hand. A true knowledge about our ancient history is not only gossiping about Anunnakis, it's also about understanding how did we end up where we are now. And one of the main driving forces, at least recently, has been this, although recent, yet very deeply rooted belief that electronics, gadgets, and technology based on such principle is the top crown jewel of development and progress. That's why most people will have difficulty comprehending how could have been the pagan people before Christian times actually more advanced than us if they didn't have electronic gadgets. The truth is that they were accomplishing most of the tasks for which we need electronics with practical daily magic. The evidence of that being the small remnants of shamanic knowledge which is still kept alive. The shamans in certain corners of the earth which are not yet completely devoured by the civilization of the smartphones, they have demonstrated many miracles even in our modern days. When the winds of change of time, the winds which change epochs, reach us, those who are tired of the civilization of the smartphones, they will be able to tune to the old vibrations of the people before Christianity, the people who didn't even know the concept of theft. The shamans of the nature people, they can travel also through time. They can reach even modern people who are interested in that old way of life of the nature people. Very often the first contact will be through the medium of the sacred plants or through the medium of sound, like this ancient vibration which the people of Asia kept for us. So when will the winds of change be upon us? This is very important to understand the timing. And the most important thing that I want to share with you in this video is what the ancient spirits showed to me about the timing. It's like this: those who wait for the change in the society to occur so that it will carry them as a tide towards heaven, this type of people may never even experience any change, even if it actually occurs and influences most other people around them, just because while waiting they remain tuned to the vibrations of the civilization of the cell phones. The truth is that the winds of change work on personal level only and on demand only for those who are determined enough to get tuned to the ancient vibrations. For them, the wind of change will start at the moment when they make that resolution. In some cases, their resolution will have the manifestation of a prayer or a solemn declaration in front of their altar and addressing their personal guardian angel and the universe. For others, that won't be needed anyway, because the resolution will start working the second they make it. And as the understanding of how to tune themselves to the ancient vibration grows, together with cleaning unnecessary beliefs picked up from the TV, the radio, or the smartphone individuals walking around, to the extent that happens, the circumstances of life of such person will also change correspondingly to resemble more and more the peaceful, harmonious environment of the nature people. For many, it will be changes in the living situation, or even possibly continuing one's life in another more beautiful dimensional timeline than in the one in which you hear this video, although the changes will manifest differently for different people according to their karmic luggage, their work will never go in vain. Even if the forces of evil blow up the earth, nothing will be lost, because the earth was fashioned as a field where the souls will come to show what can they create and to learn how to create better. We are not here to save the earth, which is only part of the theater props of the universe. What we perceive as solid matter around and what is understood by default to be the definition of reality by many is nothing else but the holographic manifestation of the thought forms of those who observe it. Hello. Have you ever heard from modern spiritual people things like, there is no karma, forget about karma. Instead, develop your personal spiritual power. That's the main thing. The idea of karma will pull you back like an anchor, so forget about it. Did it resonate with you? If it did, please listen to this video until the end, because I'm going to explain why such slogans and ideas at the end may actually prevent you from developing your personal power instead of helping you along the way. Just in a couple of words, what is this karma all about, at least in traditional sense? It's a set of circumstances into which we are born and situations which happen to us and which are predestined and custom tailored according to what we have done in other lifetimes, and all this is done with the purpose of educating us and prompting us, so to say, to develop godly qualities, because if we go the wrong way, we suffer, so the suffering is like a reminder you are going astray. Okay, let's see some of the statements which modern people who consider themselves spiritual make. Forget about karma, they say. If things were predestined, then you can't grow, you can't develop your powers, you have no choice. Things were predestined, they continue. You are like a robot. Your free will is taken away by this karma. End of quote. People who say such things, first of all, try to create a wrong impression of what karma is anyway in the understanding of the listener. Because karma doesn't mean that your entire life is predestined. It is only a concept which educates you how much is predestined, how much you can change in order to help you make wiser decisions, so that you don't incur more uncomfortable karmic situations in future lives and even in this one, because not everything is predestined. But these modern preachers, they actually deceive their audience. They're creating the impression that karma means that everything is predestined. Well, this is definitely not so in traditional sense. Yeah, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, they don't say karma means all your life is predestined. Definitely not. And also we have brilliant modern researchers who have done the painstaking task of studying meticulously many cases of children who remember past lives, who can provide evidence that they have correct information, children who speak languages which not only they have not heard, which they didn't even know existed on earth, and still they know these languages. So there is a lot of evidence about reincarnation and what kind of laws it follows, and the modern findings definitely confirm the old concept. There are exceptions for everything, and I'm sure there are some people who may think that karma means everything is predestined and you have no choice. But even if such people exist, can they be shown as typical proponents of karma? This is deceiving. And people who use deception when they preach, beware of them. So in response to what I said, these modern spiritual, considering themselves spiritual people, they will say, okay, but it doesn't matter anyway, because all your karma, it can be changed immediately when you visualize things or desire things strongly. So it doesn't matter anyway. You can change it as you go, as you wish. You are fully independent. All you need is to develop your personal power and not care about any karma. Karma can be changed in a blink. Wonderful, really wonderful. Sad that it doesn't work at all that way in real life. There are millions of people on this earth, and billions if we also take historic examples. People who suffered terribly from all kinds of miseries, physical pain, or mental or emotional agony. So what? They didn't imagine that they didn't visualize that they are getting out of this situation. They were dreaming for it many years and it never happened. Or what, didn't they wish strong enough? As the new age people diagnose the problem, oh, you didn't wish strong enough, that's why it didn't happen. Oh no, they wished very, very strong enough. But still they could not remedy their situation. Indeed, if it was like this law of attraction people preach, just imagine and things will work automatically, people wouldn't get in trouble anyway. Who would wish to get sick or suffer or be poor? It is not wrong to say that by visualization and strong wish anything can be changed. But you have to add to this that this process may take many lifetimes and it will require changes in the personality. And then the statement, when it's complete, then it's absolutely true. But to say just the half and mislead people, I don't think that's very honorable. And in addition, it may actually push away from spirituality the most intelligent and sensible people who will try this recipe. They will visualize and pray and wish something strongly. It will not happen, and they will just get disappointed with all these spiritual people. Yeah, they will, if they're new to spirituality, they will not bother to experiment with something else. They will immediately decide that all this spirituality is just nonsense. It simply doesn't work. And then the modern spiritual people will say, it doesn't matter whether you believe in karma or not, it's all the same, because at the end it's your development of your personal powers which matters. So just concentrate on that and forget about karma, even if it exists. Really, what kind of personal powers are they advising us to develop anyway, the way they speak, if this involves becoming ignorant about the laws which move the nature and the events around us? The real personal powers worth developing anyway go hand in hand with genuine knowledge, because that will set you free from misery. Putting blinders and refusing to see the laws which govern all the situations around you, that is equivalent to voluntarily insisting to remain in ignorance. There is indeed enormous power in the techniques of visualization and creating positive thought forms. These things do work, but they don't work the way some modern spiritual people are trying to convince you, especially if you buy their expensive books, where you will be assured that if you wish anything strong enough, it will definitely happen. Don't you worry at the slightest. It doesn't happen to most people. Just because there are many natural laws of our environment, the law of karma and rebirth being one of them, and if you want your visualization and cultivation of personal power to work, you need to know the rules of the game. And that involves at least basic understanding of how karma works. And actually, these people, which I called modern spiritual, they're not bad at heart. Their last intention is to deceive anybody. They just talk such things because they have heard them from others. And ultimately, all these modern ideas which demonize the knowledge of karma and rebirth, they have been planted by the parasitic forces who make everything possible to plunge us into ignorance. And as we know, they do it cunningly and gradually. So they have convinced most of the people on earth that there is no karma and that's nonsense, because everything spiritual is nonsense by default. But still there are some who don't believe them. So for them, at least they will offer like a milder version. Yeah, karma, it's okay, but you don't believe in it, even if it is there, because And here come all their Machiavellian misleading explanations. And it is really essential for them to demonize karma, to make us irresponsible, because that's how they can trick us into crimes. And we actively participate in such crimes because we are obliged to pay taxes, and with these taxes, wide varieties of terrible crime is caused, and we participate in this. Unfortunately, I cannot provide full detail of all the unbelievable crimes that we finance with our money because that will endanger my YouTube channel. People who speak the truth are either banned or their audience, their popularity is suppressed. So it's really essential for them to make the people unaware that they're responsible for what they're financing and for what they're participating in. They don't mind that people think that they're developing some sort of powers as long as they subscribe to their crimes. It's okay with them. And the worst about this full situation is that such ideas have become so fashionable. They have penetrated the circles and communities of people who are interested in spirituality to such an extent that even good modern gurus include such elements when they preach, even though they themselves otherwise well understand and value the teachings of karma and reincarnation, as proven by their own statements made under different circumstances. I had a guru years ago and he told me something, and then after a few days he told me the absolutely opposite, and I was very confused and somewhat disappointed because I was wasting time to apply the things he told me first and it didn't work, and then he tells me the opposite, and I even asked him like straightforwardly, I'm confused. First you told me this and after a few days you're telling me exactly the opposite. And he replied that only this is true, the other one is not true, but because the simple people prefer simplified ways to say things, sometimes I say that as well. After which I decided not to be his disciple anymore, just because this way of teaching was confusing me and wasting my time. Otherwise, he's a good teacher whom I recommend till nowadays to other people. So please don't leave your guru just because sometimes he says things like those debunked earlier in this video. He may actually not mean it, or in some cases it may be irrelevant even to the level you are at. For example, a fanatic religious sect, which in most cases would hardly contribute to anybody's spiritual emancipation, such a sect may ban completely alcohol. So if an alcoholic joins that sect, for him it will be actually beneficial because this spirit of fanatism and restriction, it will put a wall between him and alcohol. Hopefully he doesn't get stuck there afterwards when his head is clear enough to understand any spiritual teachings. So this video is not meant to make you critical towards any guru you may follow. I made it only to give a detail of the rules of the game in which we all participate, because understanding what's going on may save you lots of frustration. Otherwise, you may think you develop your spiritual powers for many years just to realize after decades that you have wasted your life because you've been swimming against the current and there was no progress, although you were swimming very, very hard. Or at least I did that for a certain part of my life. In the description you can find a few titles taken from this very informative list of works on reincarnation and karma, and while many of them are on the speculative side, there are some also very nice scientific publications with serious research over many years, with well documented real cases of proven reincarnation, which give us insights into how karma actually works. And some pretty interesting stuff is surfacing sometimes in this type of books. For example, do you remember in the Bible? I'm not a Bible expert, but there was some story when somebody asked Jesus, why is this man suffering? And at least part of the reply of Jesus was that he is suffering because of the sins of his ancestors. So, regardless of how fair you find this entire situation, fair or not, it seems we are affected by it because in these resources listed over there is interesting stories. For example, a father and son or a mother and son, something like that, they were separated at the birth. Yeah, sometimes it happens. And they reunited after decades. And when they met each other, they were very surprised to find out that they had accident injuries exactly at the same place. They had scars at the same places. When I heard this story, I understood actually a story which happened to me personally. Completely different context, but there was a strange sequence, very strange sequence of events happening to me and my mother, but we didn't know that the same thing is happening to both of us because we were not in touch at that time. And when we met after a few months, she started telling me what happened to her, and it was very peculiar, not something commonplace. And surprise, surprise, I was listening to the story that was happening to me at the same time, at a completely different place. So what is the conclusion of all this? We do shape the world and the events around us with our thoughts. That is the single most important thing that one has to understand in order to start getting a clue what is going on Earth and in his or her personal life. But the fact that there is correlation between our thoughts and what happens to us doesn't mean it is one-to-one projection, like you think and in few days or weeks it happens. No, it is much more complicated. For example, in this equation, is R related to X? For sure, it depends upon X, but it's not linear, it is very complex. So in the same way, R being the circumstances of your life, they depend on X, but not in a linear way. They depend on many other things as well. The law of karma and many other factors. Well, the people who preach the so-called law of attraction, what they do is they take examples showing that X and R are connected, and then they say that means X or what you think means R in few days or few weeks, as if no other correlation is possible. The ruins found in modern Egypt are certainly very impressive, but how much do we really know about them for sure? The aim of this particular episode will be to show you that whatever little can be found about what we call ancient Egyptians' ruins from the various historic sources is actually unknown to most people. They have never even heard about it. While at the same time, most of the things that we have been told are kind of indisputable facts about the history of these ruins. Most of that is either a far-fetched speculation or even deliberate lie, kind of a red herring meant to put in a wrong riverbed all future attempts to find out who and why built all this. And the truth will be very shocking for those of you who listen very carefully till the end, because we see an entire passages of the Bible, not something similar, but like real Bible passages written with hieroglyphs on the walls of these allegedly ancient Egyptian temples. And although that is well known and not disputed even by mainstream scientists, still the children in school continue to learn that these are 3,000 years old buildings. Although it usually makes sense to always start with the beginning of the history of a given culture or civilization, in the case of Egypt, we'll start with the end, with the hope that it will make the realization of how little actually we know about Egypt less painful. Because we all tend to hang to our belief system even when it's wrong, we tend to resist change, because by honestly admitting that we've been wrong about something, in most cases, that reveals that we've been wrong about many other things, and that can be quite difficult to face. And so we start with the end of the glorious so-called ancient Egyptian rulers was not in some faraway forgotten time, thousands of years ago, but just a couple of 100 years ago, when the Mamelukes, the last genuine initiated keepers of this knowledge, were mercilessly slaughtered. No, they were not bloodthirsty demons, as they are telling us nowadays. This is what we are told by their murderers. And Napoleon, whom we have been told that went to give light to Egypt, his mission was actually to destroy physically as much as he could from the still standing ancient heritage. But we are told a different story today, that he went there with a team of scientists to study the ruins. Yeah, by lining up his soldiers to shoot the face of the Sphinx.
This is a 500-year-old map, or a copy of it, kept in a museum in Nuremberg. The map depicts Constantinople, or nowadays Istanbul. We see quite an international crowd of ships, so to say, in those ancient cities. Of course, we see a ship with a Muslim flag. Then there's a ship of a two-headed eagle, which has always been and is still nowadays on the symbols of many European countries. And the third one is a sphinx, a flag with a sphinx on it. Well, sphinxes have always been a symbol of Egypt, but why is there a Christian flag as well next to the sphinx? Let's take a look into this.
When modern historians talk about the Mamelukes, these are the type of images they show us, while the contemporary artists depicted the Mamelukes in this way. So, as it is clearly visible from the mummified bodies found in the historic Egyptian burials, and from the depictions on the walls of the temples, the people who built them were a really international crowd. Clearly there were dark Africans, there were tanned people, there were blonde Caucasian people, everything was there. And it is very important to understand that the Mamelukes were actually descendants, if not in a blood sense, then surely in the sense of culture, descendants of the Caucasian blonde people that we see depicted on the temples, which we called ancient Egyptian temples, but how ancient were they should be really questioned because of the Bible inscriptions on them. But even if they are, even if we assume that they are really a couple of thousand years old, still it is very interesting and even more interesting to see the evidence that I'm gonna show you about the connections between this culture, which I call the culture of the survivors, or maybe of the Hyperboreans, which also could mean Atlantis, because it is only a guess for now that the Hyperboreans lived in the area of the North Pole. The mainstream historians are telling us that the Mamluks were slaves gathered from various countries in Asia. But this is just a modern fantasy. The sources of that time tell completely different story.
Mainstream historians are telling us that the Mamluks were slaves gathered from various countries in Asia. But this is just modern fantasy. The sources of their time tell of a completely different story. The Egyptian historian Amin al-Khali wrote an interesting book sometime in the middle of the last century, which consisted of materials that he collected from medieval Arabic historical chronicles. The name of the book is Relations Between the Inhabitants of Nile and Balgan, between 12th to 14th century.
And exactly this place, the region around the river Volga in nowadays Russia, that according to the Book of Veles is the place where initially the Slavic people landed. Was it from Hyperborea, from Atlantis, from space? We don't know, but they landed there first. And from over there they spread all over the world. And interestingly enough, the most recent DNA samples taken from Paracas, Peru, mummies of red-haired and often elongated skull mummies, they also show connection with the DNA of the people exactly of this region around the river Volga. So in his book, Al-Min al-Holi, the Egyptian historian, quotes an Egyptian sultan, historic sultan, who says,
"We and the Tartars are of one plan and will never renounce each other." Further, we read that the ramifications issued by the Egyptian sultans were fully valid within the areas of the Volga, and so the merchants who traveled back and forth were free from paying the duties that were imposed on outside traders. In other words, the Mamelukes were treated as if it was all clans in the outside areas of the river Volga. For example, the Sultan of Masur, Kalamur, although lived in Egypt many years, he never found the need to learn Arabic language. His predecessor also needed a translator when he spoke Arabic.
Hajib Ahmaz Beshtaq al-Kipchaki is one of the most famous emirs, and he did not find it suitable to use Arabic in his palace, and for that reason he also kept translators when he needed to communicate with the Arab-speaking people of Egypt at that time. These are only some of the more interesting examples and material supporting evidence and quotes which I found in the works of Anatoly Fomenko and his New Chronology project over there in his works, which are available, many of them even for free on internet. You can find much more supporting evidence. I don't agree, though, with all the interpretations of the new chronology team of this obvious evidence of connection between the European and Asian cultures and Egypt. Connection doesn't necessarily mean that the people who originally came from the Volga region created this entire civilization, which built the magnificent temples and megaliths at the delta of River Nile. There are other possible scenarios. For example, Egypt could have been a center of civilization and learning and knowledge even before the Hyperboreans got connected to it. We don't know actually. We should not assume things. So let's hear a few more quotes about the Mamelukes. Martin Baumgarten was a cavalier and a nobleman of the German Empire. He visited Egypt and wrote down his first-hand witnessed accounts of the Mamelukes at the time before their official history was fabricated. This is what he says. The Mamelukes are Christian. They baptize their children when they are born. And then he goes on giving details about the exact ritual of baptism, and later on says, and so most of the Mamelukes come from various Christian nations like Germans, Albanians, Serbs, Italians, and Spanish. Now let's see how Martin Baumgarten describes Ali Bey, the factual ruler of the Mamelukes that he met himself, and tells us about how he looked like. Ali Bey was around 45. His face was long and reddish. He was blond. His eyes were big and very clear. His beard was somewhat reddish and pointed. His eyebrows were dense. He was wearing Turkish outfits, and then he goes on describing his various turbans for various occasions. And this is not the only account of this sort. 18th century chronicle written again by a person who saw the Mamelukes with his own eyes, and that is Abd ar-Rahman al-Jabati. He described Osman Aga, who at that time was the so-called Turkish ruler of Egypt, as being blonde. This photograph is taken in year 1905, and these are the daughters of the Egyptian Khedive Abbas Halimi Pasha, who was remotely related to the Mamelukes who were wiped out some 100 years earlier. It illustrates what was the result of mixing Mamelukes with Arabic people. But what about modern descendants of the Mamelukes? Maybe they will tell us the real history. Or it will be interesting also how would they look like. Well, there aren't any. All the Mamelukes were slaughtered by those same colonial forces which slaughtered the samurais of Japan, the red-haired people of Peru, and all other communities which kept some of the old knowledge and old history. It's very convenient. When you kill them all, then you can make up any story you wish about them, and there will be nobody to object. According to the official history, Egypt was freed from the oppressive Mamelukes by the Western European military forces. And let's see when the Christian Western Europeans freed their Christian brothers, the Copts in Egypt, what did they do with them? Normally, one would expect, if that situation was true, that they would rejoice meeting other similarly minded people who glorified their Lord Jesus Christ. The truth is, they didn't care about any Jesus Christ. The monasteries lay in ruins, churches were plundered, the leaders of the clergy, no record of them. The Coptic Christianity was still pure. It still had the original message of Jesus Christ about how to modify the reality we live in with the power of our thoughts and intentions. The soldiers of the parasites quarantined the Coptic Christianity for some 50 years, waiting for one generation to die and forget the truth, and after that they kindly allow it to revive itself and resurrect again, but with changed ideology. They removed the original message of Christ and substituted it with parasitic so-called Christianity,
which emphasizes that humans are slaves, powerless slaves. They cannot do anything but wait for some unknown mercy. Nobody knows if it will come and how, but you should wait because you cannot do anything else. You are powerless. So just wait, although you're not sure what you're waiting for, but you wait, and while you wait, you the powerless slave, don't forget to be obedient, otherwise God will be angry, of course, and don't forget to pay your taxes, of course. And all these philosophies are far away from the original teachings of Christ, who taught powerful techniques of learning how to use the magical powers which we all have. The ideology of the early Copts, those before the Copt Reformation by the foreigners, their ideology was so near to the Egyptian ideology, or at least as much as we can find out about it from the translated hieroglyphic texts, that even mainstream sources don't deny that the Copts are direct continuation of that line of thinking. But how could that be possible if the so-called ancient Egyptian culture, which had that ideology, thrived thousands of years ago, and the Copts relatively recently?
As I explained earlier, one of the prime instruments in fabrication of the fraudulent history was to drive important events in culture way back in the past to make them look unimportant and irrelevant to us. The kingdoms of the Egyptian pharaohs were also artificially shifted to the faraway past, but in reality the last pharaohs were Christian themselves. Christ appeared in the already rotting from within society of the survivors to restore the truth. That is why the original pure Christianity was popular amongst the various cultures all around the globe, of whom the survivors were bedrock. And there is no wonder that we see Christianity amongst the last pharaoh kingdoms of Egypt. Mainstream historians are persistently trying to hide the very obvious and clear connection between the Copts and the pharaohs, and the ambiguous phrases like, for example, they say the magical and medicinal literature of the Copts is a direct continuation of the ancient Egyptian one.
Now listen to a short passage quote from these ancient Egyptian so-called magical texts. They don't even call them directly Christian because it will look silly, but here it is.
Hor, for, El Eloi, Adonai, Yahweh, Savov, Michael, Jesus, help us and our homes. Amen.
This type of obviously Christian prayers they call magical spells of the pharaohs, and as usual, conveniently forget to tell us the exact quotes, but will speak hours about its meaning. And all this is done to bamboozle us, to make us not notice the obvious connection between Christianity and the last pharaohs.
This is one of the items in the burial of Tutankhamun. Is there any need of commentary? Well, this is a Christian cross.
This could have been the dagger of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. It is decorated with European animals. But of course we are not sure if it was really his, because this full story with the alleged discovery of his tomb is fake, but still some of the artifacts are genuine, not sure which ones exactly, and probably they were taken from another tomb in the vicinity of the actually forged tomb of Tutankhamun. Again, the team of Anatoly Fomenko studied this tomb of Tutankhamun. They went there a few times, and I think they have the best resources on this matter, because many have discussed the possible forgery of this alleged tomb discovery.
Everybody knows that many of the ancient Egyptian paintings, or maybe at this point we should stop calling them ancient, but since they are famous as being ancient, excuse me if sometimes I still say that by mistake, so those are full of crosses, and if somebody still doubts that those crosses by chance look like Christian crosses, here on this one you can see the Christian cross in it. This is not exact the time when supposedly some ancient Egyptian temples were subsequently converted into churches, as the mainstream historians cunningly try to convince us. Here is another Christian cross that they have forgotten to hide, and it's still visible amongst the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic signs. And this is another one laying there in the corner in one of the ancient Egyptian temples. Two ancient Egyptian statues with Christian crosses on their back. And these are Coptic images. The crosses are very, very similar to the Egyptian crosses. Here are a few more Egyptian Ankh crosses. And so, sometime in the end of the 18th century, some Jesuits are being sent to Egypt to start fabricating the future image of ancient Egypt as we know it nowadays, and which is absolute historical fiction. Remember earlier it was exactly Jesuits who took a very active part in fabricating the books that would serve as the basis of the fictional history during the Reformation period. Egyptology as science started existing very, very late in the 19th century. At that time, the Scaliger version of history was already widely accepted as scientific, and the Egyptologists were forced to adjust everything to fit those mistaken axioms that were laying the basis of the timeline of Scaliger. And if they would disagree with the Scaliger timeline, they wouldn't be employed as official scientists anymore, very much like today actually. Sometimes so-called ancient sources are quoted to support the Scaliger Pitavius timeline of Egyptian history. However, please be aware that, for example, the most famous of them, the work of Manethon, is not available in original nowadays. And so if you see some quote from Maniphone, well, it is very easy to manufacture all of that, to fabricate it, because the original is no longer available. So you can put any fantasy and label it as coming from Maniphone, no problem. And so is the situation with all other so-called ancient sources. As far as the official history of the various dynasties and times of rule, of reign of various pharaohs, that was easily fabricated by Henry Bruch, who approached the matter in a very practical way. He took various lists from the temple carvings. Some of them definitely were names of pharaohs. Others was not sure, but he took some lists that he liked, and also assuming, according to his liking, that those were only pharaohs. Others, they didn't fit so well, so declared them mythical, mythology, and did not include them. And then to fix easily the dates of their reign, he just decided that everybody has ruled 33 years, or to be more exact, 100 years for every 3 pharaohs. And that is how this full history was cooked and was ready to be served to the public as science. Egypt was one of the most important centers of the culture of the survivors. Over there, the knowledge of the magical abilities of the humans was kept alive until few hundred years ago by Copts and Mamelukes, and that is why it was very important for the soldiers of the parasites to distort the Egyptian history in such a monstrous way. And so people are confused. There is one thing in the history books, but the actual artifacts point towards completely different story, and they don't know what to think. Did aliens build all this? Because according to history we could not have built them. We were barely coming out from the monkeys.
The myth that it was Champollion who deciphered the hieroglyphs is very popular.
But if you delve even a little bit in history, you will easily find out that people were reading the hieroglyphs even before that. The problem with reading them the traditional way was that full passages with the Bible content were shining from the walls of the Egyptian temples, and that was not allowed because those temples were artificially sent thousands of years back in history. There was a dictionary, so to say, guide how to read the hieroglyphs by Horapollo, and that was natural to exist because when in Egypt they shifted from hieroglyphs to other writings, there was the need of a dictionary, and Horapollo compiled it, and it worked fine. If it was mistaken, then the result would be some sort of unintelligible text. But the result, people and researchers were using his dictionary to read the inscriptions on the temples, and the result was okay, it was very sensible, but it was declared false because it did not fit the fabricated history of Scaliger and Petavius.
And they used a cheap trick to do it. First of all, they publicly declared that Horapollo was wrong. He's just wrong. That was done, of course, using the usual magical mantra, the scientists said, because modern people will believe anything if this mantra is put in front of the statement.
After that, it was publicly and very loudly announced that Champollion, hurrah, hurrah, has finally deciphered the hieroglyphs. And after the society was informed about that and believed it, then, without much publicity within the scientific society only, it was confessed that, oh, but Horapollo was right after all about so many things. And what are these so many things?
Well, practically everything besides the most essential points, the most essential things
which they wanted to hide from people, like, for example, details of how the ancient Egyptians manipulated energy, so that we can't learn that as well. Also, they changed the meaning of some words, which clearly showed again and again that the last pharaohs were Christians. But that worked only partially, because even in modern news, even very recently again, oh, a new discovery, and yet another Bible text word to word inscribed on the ancient Egyptian temple wall. The modern history textbooks with great authority assure us that Napoleon visited Egypt to give it a light. Napoleon gave light to Egypt. It freed it from oppression. Let's see what kind of light was that. Was it not the same light that was brought to the samurais by the so-called merchant ships? Contemporaries wrote about Napoleon's visit in this way. Napoleon did a lot in Egypt, really a lot. But a lot of what? And was it really about giving light, or things that should not have been done by real gentlemen? Even mainstream chronicles mention that he lined up his soldiers against the Sphinx and ordered them to shoot in its face. Along with Napoleon, with his army, were traveling many scientists, writers, and painters. Let's see what were they exactly doing in Egypt. In the second half of 16th century, Pierre Bellon reports that the outer casing of the Great Pyramid is completely intact and looks newish. Jean Chenot is the secretary of the French embassy in Egypt, and in 1548 he records that most of the outer casing of the Great Pyramid is still intact. A very interesting medieval first-hand witness gives us valuable information. The physician from Baghdad, Abd al-Latif, writes, "The outer lining of the Great Pyramid is all covered with very ancient writing. Nobody understands anymore this writing. The inscriptions are so abundant that if somebody wanted to copy them, that would be more than 10,000 pages." A Masudi traveler from the Masudi tribe also shares his account that the Great Pyramid is all covered with various inscriptions in alphabets belonging to various nations that have disappeared a long time ago. Three other medieval travelers confirm basically the same thing, and those are Ibn Hawqal, Abu Mashat Jafar, and Wilhelm de Boldenzele. So the question arises, how come the locals in the area of Cairo started needing building material exactly when the West Europeans attacked Egypt? Were the locals not building houses before that? Were they building them out of water? No, they always needed building material. However, before Egypt was mercilessly attacked by the Western Europeans, the guardians of the pyramids and of the Egyptian culture were still living, still besides them, guarding them. Napoleon did not come to give light to Egypt. He came to destroy its culture. And that is why the lining of the magnificent Great Pyramid was turned into building material. Maybe the locals were even invited and encouraged to take it away because the inscriptions on it were uncomfortable for the Scaliger Pitavius timeline. Napoleon also took priceless pieces of art to Europe, where they lay till nowadays, most of them in the vaults, because they are not suitable for public display. These are modern video games for kids. Since small, the children of the human race are brainwashed to become cruel parasites destroying the culture, that celebrates peace, beauty, and harmony. They are trained since childhood to accept the parasitic, ugly, violent, cruel existence as something natural. These particular video games replicate exactly this historic period of the time when Napoleon raped Egypt.
The modern kids are encouraged to take a virtual part in this shameful event, and when they grow up, they will be already trained in going to foreign lands to destroy peaceful cultures.
So what about Champollion? In the archive of the Italian city Turin, in year 1824 was written down the following. Champollion was very careful, especially when it comes to rewriting the names and dates connected with the rulers of Egypt. Rewriting. This was recorded by the Italian Posiner. Now this is interesting. Peter Ellerbach writes about the visit of the architect Fritz Max Hessemer in 1829 in Egypt. Here it goes. I was very unlucky that I ended up in Egypt right after Champollion. What did that guy do over there? The tomb of Fever was one of the best. It was preserved in its pristine state. There were no damages. But after Champollion, the most beautiful items in it are simply broken down and they lay around into pieces. Those who have seen it before and after cannot recognize it. In the first half of the 19th century, a book was published under the name Wanderings of a Russian Sailor in Egypt, Syria, and Greece. He was a great admirer, and he was always crying at the thought that he will finally see the miracles that he has heard about. He had the descriptions of Champollion, but when he went on the actual spots, the things were not there, and he asked the locals what happened. He asked the local Arab where are the things that Champollion writes about, and much to his surprise, the Arab answered that it was Champollion himself who destroyed the inscriptions. The Arab at that time still himself remembers Champollion doing it. The seller was perplexed and asked why would he do that, and the Arab answered Champollion wanted to be the only one who knows what was actually written there. Those of you who have visited Egypt are well aware that, or even only from photos on the internet, one can easily see that many of the sites are in very poor condition and they're really destroyed on purpose with hammers and chisels. With great authority, the modern historians assure us that it was the Egyptians themselves who did all that, to supposedly erase the memory of pharaohs who they stopped liking. Of course, that is fabricated only nowadays. There are no authentic records suggesting anything like this. And even if we just think with our own head a little bit, we'll find out that such scenario is quite fishy. Why? The Egyptians obviously took great care of decorating the world around them. They liked beautiful things, it's obvious from the items and buildings that they left behind. Obviously, they were not people that were devoid of artistic taste. And now, in case such people really wanted to get rid of the memories of a particular pharaoh, do you really believe that they will break down their beautiful buildings in the middle of their main squares with in a most barbarian way with hammers? Wouldn't they just chisel out the name of the pharaoh and substitute it with something else? Most likely, this savage destruction of the beautiful Egyptian buildings started when the Europeans came to bring light to Egypt.
Get you to